This video is sponsored by Keeps. More on them later. Man, I sure do love doing things wrong. I mean, I've had enough practice of it in the past, but having fought so many boss fights over the years, I do sometimes like to do them wrong, you know? Whether it's becoming a little bored of how fights usually go, or if I'm hunting for glitches, or just simply an alternate method of defeating the same boss fight. There are a lot of games out there that offer up a bunch of different solutions to beating the same boss, but the ones that are usually a little more rigid can sometimes hide very fun and very unusual alternate strategies. So yeah, we're going to find out some of the funky quirks that some particularly creative game designers decided that a boss fight should have. There's more out there than you realise. I remember seeing these kind of boss fight workarounds a lot as a kid, if just because I was more willing to experiment back then. But, you know, I'm 27 now, I kind of need to spend less time experimenting and more time looking after my hair. And thanks to this video sponsor's Keeps, I can do that really nicely with their FDA approved treatment for hair loss. You know, my birthday was earlier this week, I should probably just, you know, take some care now. Many moons ago, the idea of fighting off the inevitable march of hair loss just wasn't very attainable at all, and yet this video sponsor's Keeps have made huge strides in the science of preventing hair loss. 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness before they turn 35, and so we have to be thankful that Keeps are doing so much good work in this field. These guys are very clever when it comes to preventing hair loss with their FDA approved treatment that comes with years of experience and loads of successful cases under their belts. In fact, they're so good at what they do that they know that hair loss is different from one guy to the next, which is why their treatment comes in 3 different variants depending on what kind of hair loss you're experiencing. Plus, you can get everything shipped directly to your door, so you don't have to wait for the world to not be so terrible before you can fix your hair. Keeps' treatment packages are already cheaper than their competitors, but with the deal they're running with me, you can save even more money. For a limited time offer, you can go to keeps.com/rabbid or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Stop hair loss now before it's too late. Anyway, let's do some lateral thinking. Along with another franchise that we'll get to in a minute, Metal Gear has to be the champion of weird boss fights that have quirky hidden weaknesses. I'm not sure if that speaks more to Hideo Kojima's personal design philosophy that as many boss fights as possible need this extra little feature, or if it's just a spillover from all the attention to detail that exists elsewhere in these games. Either way, a lot of bosses in this franchise have alternate ways to kill them, ranging from Psycho Mantis being undone by plugging your controller into a different port, to the end kicking the bucket on his own if you take too long, but my personal favourite is actually a lot less complicated mechanically than either of those. Metal Gear Solid 5 prides itself on having about 7 million solutions to every problem, and so no one should be surprised to hear that the handful of boss fights in this game can be bested by a bunch of weird shit. Running down skulls in a tank, water pistol the fireman to death, dropping supply crates on Quiet's head. It's a jolly fun time. Playing the sniper duel with Quiet normally is actually some crazy nonsense. The game does a pretty good job of selling Quiet's abilities as a crack sniper juicing on parasites, because when Snake's out in the open, she rarely misses and takes more than her pound of flesh. It's a simple enough conflict with a player having to rely on finding flanking routes on Quiet so they don't just get shit on every time they aim down sights, and I actually love that the extreme version of this boss is pretty much an insta-death because, you know, that's probably realistic. Less realistic is ringing up Pequod to airdrop some supplies on Quiet's head, which is absolutely something you can do in this game, so long as you've scanned her and can find her on a map, and despite having superhuman strength and perception, Quiet will fully sit there and take a supply crate to the head, with 2 of them being enough to take her out non-lethally. Again, not even remotely in keeping with her character, but is it bad AI or just a natural quirk of how objects interact with enemies? Nah, it could just be bad AI.
Kept you waiting, huh?
She should hum quieter, really. It is very hard for a horror game to have multiple different ways of defeating a boss, because that kind of goes against what a horror game is all about. You should be floundering around desperately looking for one solution, not be inundated with loads of different options. Luckily, Resident Evil 4 is a game that, for the most part, left horror at the door and in just favour of, you know, shooting everything and hoping for the best. Let's face it, most problems in Resident Evil 4 can be solved really nicely by filling them with bullets. Especially the further you go into the game, all the nuance of carefully aiming for headshots on enemies so you can stun them in a way that you can then follow up with some kind of melee attack kind of falls by the wayside a bit when you pick up stronger weapons that can put larger holes in all these zombies. One of the few exceptions found kind of early in Resi 4 is the stupid QTE knife fight with Krauser, which I've never enjoyed since the QTEs are infrequent and have such a fine margin for error that you basically have to memorize when they turn up and what buttons you need to press to not meet a grisly end. So yeah, Krauser is a little bitch who only fights in cutscenes, but to his credit, you do get a boss fight with him later in the game once he's decided to fully embrace his inner Las Plagas and get this huge fleshy sword thing on his arm. Probably a good idea to use a big gun now. And yet no, because while that may seem like the smart thing to do so you don't get skewered, the truth of the matter is that the earlier QTE knife fight holds the secret to winning this fight really easily. Namely, just flail your knife around at Krauser. I really do mean flail too, since Leon only has one animation for using the knife, as it's mainly a tool for opening barrels and crates and sometimes racking up free damage on regular enemies, but it's simply too slow for it to have any kind of practical use in boss fights. That is except for Krauser though, who despite being made of flesh and blood is a bit of a bullet sponge who will shrug off most of what you shoot at him with ease. Well, at least until you start throwing out the world's slowest knife swings, at which point Krauser will decide that sharpened steel is clearly his biggest weakness and fold like fresh laundry. I remember struggling on this fight for ages since I naturally assumed that normal-ass Soldier Man would take more damage from guns than a knife, but Capcom wanted to call back to that silly QTE knife fight, and so yeah, logic takes a day off here. What do you mean that Resident Evil 4 isn't completely accurate to real life? Something to fix in the remake, I suppose. There's so much to see and do in Persona 5 that my mind isn't big enough to fit it all in. Big ups to anyone who's 100% at this game, because I gave it a go and I was just too overwhelmed by how many different things there are to do in Persona 5. Maxing out all your confidence is one thing, but then there's your social stats and all the side quests and eating a ton of really big burgers, and that's without even mentioning mementos and all the stuff you can do in there. Seasoned Persona players will have known before even playing Persona 5 that the Reaper would turn up at some point because he's been an ever-present part of the series since the third one, and that's a problem because the Reaper is a really strong optional boss who only appears in mementos when you've spent too long on one floor. Yeah, for 100% he needs to die, and that means a lot of level grinding and high-level strategizing because he's crazy strong and likes to throw around insta-kill attacks like confetti. Oh, and he's considered a boss enemy, so status conditions, critical hits, and your own insta-kill attacks do jack shit to him. So just a really fun time all around then. It's important to remember with anything to do with the Persona games that they never take themselves all that seriously. Yeah, I know there's some very mature themes kicking around in there, and people say fuck sometimes, but in general it's a game made by Japanese people who like to joke around, and you know, if there's a really hard optional boss fight in there and they have the opportunity to make it into a joke, you know they'll find a way. A feature that usually isn't all that important in regular Persona 5 gameplay is the changing weather. Different weather can have small effects in specific locations, like how rain shuts down most outdoor activities with confidence, but for the most part the only type of weather that you'll want to pay attention to is the special weather. You know, stuff like pollen warnings and heat waves, and for what we need right now, flu season. In real life, that time over winter where flu is usually more prominent, but in Persona 5, a brief couple of days where Shadows in Mementos may also be suffering from the flu and will have the despair effect at the start of battle. This means that there's roughly a 20% chance of the Reaper having despair when you find him during flu season, and while he's got the flu, he won't be able to use any moves for 3 turns. Even better, he dies automatically at the end of the 3rd turn, so as long as you're fighting this thing on certain days, it's an automatic win every time. Also, it's an optional boss at level 70, so that's actually enough experience points for this to become a legit grinding strategy. I've never seen the flu be so useful before. I'm just wondering how all this stuff applies to real life and how realistic it is that a big bad boss man has a strange unexpected weakness. You know, like, you could probably defeat me with like a sword, but also I'm no good to anyone if I have the flu, so I think that checks out. Also, if you want to like reflect my attacks with crockery, I think that'll go quite well for you. For anyone watching who worked out that I was referring to The Legend of Zelda when I said that Metal Gear was one of 2 franchises that loves having alternate strategies for taking down bosses, that's some mighty fine work, my friend. I'm not too sure where this stems from though. Perhaps the older games like A Link to the Past that allowed you to take down certain bosses with items that you didn't get from the same dungeon? And it is a massive deal when Zelda does this because of that very rule. You should expect the boss fight at the end of the dungeon to use the new item you picked up earlier, but of course, when you're at the end of the game, you're probably out of new items to pick up, so expect the unexpected. Yes, you can use a fishing rod to distract Ganondorf at the end of Twilight Princess because Desert Man's never gone fishing before, but my personal favourite comes from Ocarina of Time. You're psyching yourself up for the end of this game, which I gotta say, really knew how to set up a spectacle as you've conquered every corner of Ganon's castle and climbed up to the upper levels, slaying entire floors of enemies along the way. It's ramping up the tension and the drama as high as possible for a one-on-one confrontation that has been a long time coming. It's the first time that Ganondorf has ever been fought in 3D, and Ocarina of Time has set itself up perfectly for a historic duel for the ages. Ah, true, and if you do this fight with the Master Sword or Begoron's Sword, you may well get that sense, but the world's most well-known secret is that you can deflect Ganon's energy balls back at him with the swing of an empty bottle, because glassware is just built differently in Hyrule. I suppose it makes a little bit of sense since using the bottle has a swinging animation to it, which theoretically could be used to see off the King of Evil, but the sight of Link refusing to use a legendary sword to fight Ganon in favour of something you can drink milk out of is... yeah, it's a lot. Evidently something that Nintendo themselves are proud of, since you could do the same with Phantom Ganon earlier in this game, and the same with Wind Waker's Phantom Ganon. All of this power and a bottle is your undoing. I wonder if there's a piece of the Triforce that can help with that. With perhaps the exception of Ocarina of Time, you may be getting the sense that boss fights having weird alternate ways of overcoming them is a modern phenomenon, brought about because of an increased focus on games having more quirky pseudo Easter eggs to them. Well, perhaps it's fitting then that we're ending this video by talking about the oldest game of the lot, because if you're after a boss fight that hides a secret way of winning, then hot damn do you need to play some early Fallout games. I say early because as soon as Bethesda took over, a lot of the nuance was beaten out of this franchise in favour of shooting them guns. Fallout 1 is a goddamn institution though, with a heavy focus on giving the player lots of choice of how they want to solve a problem, and not just going all guns blazing all the time. Even the central conflict of the game can be worked around if you have the right skills and know what you're doing, since you're mainly trying to stop this gooey talking head guy called the Master from taking over the world of mutants and gradually reforming humanity to have more of a mutant look to it so it can better thrive in this post-apocalyptic world. That's lofty ambitions for someone without a body. Fallout 1 being the Giga Chad's game of choice lets you take a number of different avenues here. For a start, you can just agree with the Master and let him do his thing with the mutants, and the game will happily let you do that, for as nightmarish as that is. Or you could turn up with your biggest guns and see how that John Carpenter ass face looks after eating some lead. And yeah, that's likely what most people did. It's like the final boss, you need to turn up with, some pretty strong guns, something to work towards. However, if your speech is high enough and you've done the right research, you can talk the Master down by proving to him that all mutants are sterile and therefore can't create this master race that he wants so badly. Overcome with guilt now that he's realised that all the atrocities he's committed weren't so useful after all, he'll tell you to leave so he can detonate the convenient nuke he keeps under his building and kill himself. So, in summary, if you're persuasive enough in Fallout 1, you can circumvent the need for combat and simply convince the primary antagonist to stop all this nonsense and commit suicide instead. Now, I'm beginning to understand why future Fallout games were a little more shooty. When you have those kinds of powers of persuasion, you don't really have a lot of conflict in your game. Maybe I'm the real villain, did we think about that? The first 2 Fallout games are full of moments like this, and it makes me wish that modern Fallout could find more alternative ways to avoid combat. Maybe not something this extreme though. I think powers like this should probably stay in the 90s. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more in the future, and if you watch another one, there's another one here where I rank every single Kirby game. I just want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Devon Hutt, Raina Bana Bobana, and Sarah Malion. Thank you for watching, and always work on your speech.